Hi, boys and girls. Today we are on Chapter 6, The Never Want to Go to Bedder's Cure. I wonder what Mrs. Piggle Wiggle is going to come up with for this. Each evening, as the clock struck 8, Mrs. Gray called Bobby and Larry and Susan, and she said, "Come, children, 8 o'clock and time for bed." She tried to make her voice sound cheerful and gay, but actually she felt like groaning because she knew what was coming. First, Susan, "Oh, we don't want to go to bed now. Please let us stay up a little longer. Please, Mother, please." Then Bobby, "We are the only ones in our whole neighborhood who have to go to bed at 8 o'clock. And then Larry, "Mother, nobody, not anybody at all goes to bed at 8 o'clock. And then Susan again, "But Mother, we have only just started the game." And then Bobby, "Please let us finish this game, please." Then Larry, "Just one more turn, Mother. It's my turn, Mother, and I won't win. I haven't won a game this evening, please." Mrs. Gray said, "Now, Bobby, Larry, and Susan, you know that if you want to grow up into fine young men and women, you must have plenty of sleep. I'm sure they teach you that in school." "We don't want to grow up. We just want to finish this game," Bobby wailed. And so night after night, poor Mrs. Gray argued and pled and begged her children to go to bed, and by the time they had finished whining and complaining, it was usually almost 9 o'clock. And Mrs. Gray was getting desperate. Finally, one day she called her friend Mrs. Grassfeather, and she said, "Hello, Mrs. Grassfeather, this is Mrs. Gray, and I would like to find out what time Catherine and Wilfred go to bed." Mrs. Grassfeather said, "Why, at 8 o'clock, Mrs. Gray, unless their Uncle Jasper comes for dinner, and then I usually let them stay up until 9:30 to hear Uncle Jasper tell about his experiences in the Boer War. That, of course, is strictly Mr. Grassfeather's idea. He not only allows the children to stay up until 9:30, but he pays them as well for listening to Uncle Jasper while he goes to bed." Mrs. Gray said, "Do the children like to go to bed at 8 o'clock? And Mrs. Grassfeather said, "Oh, they are good about it because they know if they whine and complain, I will not let them stay up the next time Uncle Jasper comes over, which is about 4 nights a week." As the Grays had no Uncle Jasper, Mrs. Gray realized that Mrs. Grassfeather could be of no help, and she said goodbye and hung up the phone. Then she called Mrs. Gardenfield. "Hello, Mrs. Gardenfield. This is Mrs. Gray, and I called to see what time Worthington and Guinevere go to bed at night." Mrs. Gardenfield said, "Oh, they go to bed any time after Daddy comes home. You see, Mrs. Gray, Mr. Gardenfield gets home at 4:30, and we have dinner at 5:30, and the children, Mr. Gardenfield and I, all go to bed at 6:30. "6:30, said Mrs. Gray, amazed. "My goodness, that is early." Mrs. Gardenfield said, "It's not early if you get up at 4:30. Mrs. Gray said, "But who wants to get up at 4:30? "We do," said Mrs. Gardenfield, and hung up the phone in a huff. So Mrs. Gray thought, and suddenly she remembered that only yesterday Dick Thompson's mother had been telling her about a wonderful little woman named Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. And so, even though she had never seen Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, she decided to call her on the telephone and ask her to help with her never want to go to bedders. She said to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, "I am Mrs. Gray, the mother of Bobby, Larry, and Susan." And Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Oh, yes, of course. How are the children? I have not seen them since they returned from camp." Mrs. Gray said, "Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, Bobby and Larry and Susan are very well and very cooperative until about 8 o'clock at night, and then they turn into whiny, complaining little non-cooperators." Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Oh, yes, I see. They are never want to go to bedders, aren't they?" Mrs. Gray said, "How on earth did you know?" And Mrs. Piggle Wiggle laughed and said, "Oh, that's one of the commonest of the children's ailments. The moment you said they were good until 8 o'clock, I knew what the trouble was." Mrs. Gray said, "Do you know anything to do for them? How to cure this hateful disease?" Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Oh, that's very simple. Beginning tonight, don't tell them to go to bed. Let them stay up as late as they want to. You and Mr. Gray go on to bed any time you are tired, but leave the children downstairs." Mrs. Gray said, "But their health, won't that ruin their health?" Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Oh, I do not believe that a day or so without sleep will harm them, and it will certainly cure them. It is really worth a try, Mrs. Gray, but if you have any trouble and the cure doesn't seem to be working, call me." Mrs. Gray said, "Oh, thank you so much, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. I will let you know tomorrow how we're getting along." And that night at 8 o'clock, the clock struck, and Mrs. Gray continued to mend socks and say nothing about bed. And Mr. Gray changed the TV station, and Bobby and Larry and Susan played Parcheesi. And at 9 o'clock, the clock struck again, and Mrs. Gray put down the socks and took up a woman's magazine, and Mr. Gray changed the TV, and Bobby and Larry and Susan continued to play Parcheesi. And when 10 o'clock struck, Mrs. Gray yawned and put down the magazine. Mr. Gray snapped off the TV, and Larry and Susan and Bobby began another game of Parcheesi. At 10:30, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went upstairs to bed and left the children playing Parcheesi. At 12 o'clock, Mrs. Gray awoke and at first thought there were burglars in the house, and then she remembered the never want to go to bedders. So she tiptoed down the stairs, and there was Bobby and Larry and Susan playing Parcheesi on the living room rug. The next morning, the children slept until 11:30. About 9 o'clock, Dick Thompson's mother stopped by to take them to the beach, but Mrs. Gray told her they were still asleep. And when the children finally got up, they were cross and quarrelsome. And when their mother told them about Mrs. Thompson inviting them to the beach, they said, "Why didn't she wait for us? Why didn't you wake us up? I think Mrs. Thompson's mean not to wait." And Mrs. Gray said, "I see no reason why Mrs. Thompson and Dick should have their day spoiled waiting for 3 little members of the all-night Parcheesi Club to get up. Now come and eat your breakfast and stop complaining." That night, after dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Gray went to a movie picture show and left Larry and Bobby and Susan playing tiddlywinks. And when the Grays came home about 12:30, the children were still up playing tiddlywinks and quarreling about whose turn it was. The next morning, they had a 9 o'clock dentist appointment, so Mrs. Gray got them up at 8. What do you think is going to happen? When will the children ever go to sleep? Comment below, and we'll talk again tomorrow. Have a good day.